Hi everybody, I hope you're all doing okay on this Friday. You'll see if you've been watching my videos that I'm in a new room in my home today because both of my children are attending school in person. So I have access to the living room for the day. I'm very excited about that. I have some feedback for you and some things to think about for Hess, and I'm going to try to keep this nice and short. First of all, the post that you put on Blackboard, those of you who did it, were great. You should go look at what your classmates have to say. And for those of you who have not posted on Blackboard yet, go ahead and post on Blackboard. I will still give you credit. It is so much better for you if you start thinking about the stuff and writing it out than if you wait till the last moment. So I've got 5 main things I want to bring up about Hess. The first, I want to give a shout out to Crystal. You should all go read what she wrote on Blackboard, calling into question Hess's portrayal of education research. And I think Hess does a really nice job letting us know that research says isn't always as thorough as we think it is, and it's really important to think about what's being researched, what kinds of questions are being asked. And Crystal points out that some of the research that Hess dismisses actually doesn't support his point, right? And in particular, he talks about these studies saying, oh, class size reduction, class size reduction leads to better outcomes. And then when people tried to implement it elsewhere, it didn't work out. As Crystal pointed out, it's not true that we don't know why. We do know why. They didn't actually replicate the intervention. The studies in Tennessee had very small class sizes, and when places like California did statewide class size reduction, they only reduced the classes by a few students per pupil, which you're not going to get as big of a payoff for. So I thought that was just a really nice, for Crystal, use of looking at Hess and then asking critical questions. Okay, so here's 3 other points I want to make. One has to do with Hess's vision of reform, and I'm going to bring us back to the same quote that I put up in the chat on Monday. Right, so Hess says, I'm losing my place here, Hess says, he defines reform as system change. He says mostly a matter of opening up outdated systems so that educators, entrepreneurs, parents, and communities can reinvent schooling to better educate every child. And we spent a lot of time in class on Monday talking about entrepreneurs and what they're doing in a sentence about school reform and what role they would play in terms of what kind of risks they're taking and what kind of benefits they might get. But I want to call attention to the idea that he says reform is opening up outdated systems, right? Opening up outdated systems so that we can reinvent schooling, right? So he's not talking about making some small changes here and there. He wants to kind of blow up our current education system and how it's organized. In that sense, he's pretty radical. He's more radical than a lot of the other people who we've read, right? So that's just something I want to point out, is that he's really asking us to think differently about schools or how schools are organized. We know he doesn't like centralized control, but again, remember, there's nothing in our U.S. Constitution about education. It's all in our state constitutions. He doesn't mention the state a whole bunch in this book. It's mostly a criticism of federal reform. Most reform happens at the state level, and it's implemented usually at a district level. He doesn't really talk about school districts here much. So how does he think schools should be organized? That's something for you to think about. I also want to point out a section that no one pointed out on the blog, but I think is really important. On page 30, he talks about implementation reform. Excuse me. He talks about problems with implementation. And I think he does a really nice job pointing out how we think about policy sometimes in ways that aren't helpful. And this, I would argue, is beyond education. This is true in many, many policy arenas, maybe all of them. He says there's no such thing as an implementation problem. What matters in schooling is what actually happens to 50 million kids in 100,000 schools. That's all implementation. Calling something an implementation problem is how we reformers let ourselves off the hook. It's a fancy way to avoid saying that we didn't realize how a new policy would affect real people, and it turned out worse than we promised. The proper word for that is a problem, period. So saying we have a great idea, but it was implemented incorrectly, according to Hess, that's the wrong way of thinking about it. If it's not working on the ground, there's a problem with the policy. And remember, Tayek and Cuban told us that when we have ideas that come from on top, they can be implemented differently in different contexts, right? And so these two ideas kind of go hand in hand. When you have an idea up here, and then it gets, they talk about in policy world, diffused, it gets sent out, and different locations are supposed to implement it, it's going to look different in different places. And if it doesn't have the results that the policymakers envisioned, is it that their policy was wrong, or that the way it was implemented was wrong? And according to Hess, the policy is faulty if it can't be implemented the way that the people envisioned it. Okay, number 4, I want to talk a little bit about Hess's vision of school choice. We are going to spend more time talking about school choice in a few weeks, but many of you talked about in the blog posts, in the Blackboard discussion posts, questions you had about what choice looks like, who gets to choose, what happens if a school fails under his choice system. And I should have written a little arrow here so I'd remember. So he talks about choice, and he says, the research hasn't really shown the outcomes we wanted, but I don't want to focus on the research because basically he says ideologically choice is the better way to go. That's part of our, who we are as a people. We all want more choices about our lives, including where we send our children to school or what kind of schools our children go to. And he tells us on page 89, terrific schools are typically defined by a shared set of expectations, a faculty that's committed to the school's mission, and students and families who broadly agree on what they want from the school. So his argument for choice is everyone wants to be there and they all agree on what they hope to accomplish there, what the values of the school are. This is an argument we hear a lot for choice. He also says good schools need an ecosystem that supports them, but he doesn't tell us what that ecosystem will look like. If we're not organizing schools with the State Department of Education and districts that are overseeing things, what kind of ecosystem supports this free market system of schools that Hess envisioned? So that's a question that you might want to ask yourselves. And then the last point I want to make is another question that I asked a few of you to consider on the Blackboard post, which is a lot of you said, I really like a lot of what Hess has to say, but I'm concerned that he never mentions racial and class inequality, or he rarely does. And in fact, his vision, he thinks that reform should be for everybody. He's not focused on trying to close an opportunity gap or achievement gap or even acknowledge it. But if he did, what would that look like? Can you imagine the kind of big R, little r critique that he has? Can you imagine his opposition to top-down reform in the context of a vision where race and inequality are at the center? So that's something to think about. What would this look like? Another way to think about it is, can we have policies whose purpose is equity without a top-down? Is there another mechanism that would work? And we're going to switch gears starting on Monday. We're reading Noli Brooks. A lot of you enjoyed her critique of Laborie that we read the first week of school. We're now going to read from her new book starting this week, and she does put race at the center of her vision of reform. So a different perspective from Hess, certainly. Okay, as always, I'm available if you want to email me with questions. Those of you who have not submitted a paper and have not contacted me, please do. I hope you're able to enjoy your weekend. I look forward to seeing you on Zoom on our regular Monday.